Morning. Good to see everybody today and those at home on Zoom. Welcome to our service today. Glad to have you with us today. I'm going to have to find something that has pockets in it because this is crazy to almost take the clothes off and get the thing into the right pocket there. Let me set this down. One thing that is of interest, I mentioned last week, who heard me preach, is that we always have to pay attention to the historical context out of which the scriptures come. And Noel, when you read it today, there are lots of names, lots of names and locations to pay attention to. It was Luke's way of telling us that this story of Jesus is not some myth or some made-up thing, or whatever it might be. He's saying this story of Jesus is located in a very specific moment in time, when Tiberius was emperor of Rome. Of course, all the audience that Luke is speaking to would immediately know who they're talking about. Each of these, they would be familiar to the people in Luke's audience. So it's to set us in a moment in time, meaning in the first century of the Common Era, in the Roman Empire, which is also an indicator, which is in the territory, the Roman territory of Judea or Galilee, which is in the north. So each of those are telling us certain things. And if you had about 3 more hours, I could tell you all about those things, but I don't think that we would want to spend that amount of time doing that. So one of the important things is to note in this story is that Luke uses a text from the prophet Isaiah. Now, if we were to have more than one reading, it's interesting that in the lectionary cycle of Luke, we don't get the Isaiah text. It's only in the Matthew cycle of the readings do we get the Isaiah text. The Old Testament reading in the lectionary is from Baruch, which really doesn't have anything to do with this text in the Gospel of Luke. So let me give you an idea of this, all right? Historically, again, if you bear with me for a moment, historically, at the time of David and Solomon, the great kingdom of Israel was established about 1,000 years before the Common Era. At the death of Solomon, the northern tribes split off and formed what's called Israel, and the southern 2 tribes split off and formed what's called Judah. And so now there are 2 kingdoms, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. They go their own separate ways for many things. Again, a couple of more hours of background information, which would put everybody to sleep. And all of you at home on Facebook would just click off or click the sound off. And that probably, as I sometimes do, hopefully you're not doing it on Facebook, but I usually put up another page and go about my business doing other things while the Zoom serves. No, I hope you all aren't doing that, seriously. In any event, both of these kingdoms are weak. And so around them are stronger nations. One being Assyria, if anybody's ever heard of Assyria. And Assyria ends up conquering the northern kingdom of Israel and sends the people away in 722 before the Common Era. The southern kingdom survives for another couple of 100 years. But eventually, the new kingdom, Babylon, rises up. This is the short version of this whole history, all right? The southern kingdom is destroyed, with Jerusalem being destroyed about 586 before the Common Era. And all of the people in one wave of deportation, all the intelligentsia, the business leaders, the Wall Street people, they all get sent over to Babylon. In the second destruction in 586, most of the people, except the poor people and the farmers, stay, and everybody else goes over to Babylon. And there in Babylon, roughly about 50 years is what the time of the exile, they call this time the exile. About 50 years, the Israelites are in exile. It is while they are in exile that the Babylonian kingdom is destroyed by the Persian kingdom. So that Cyrus the Great, king of the Persians, which is modern day Iran, destroys Babylon and issues a decree that the Israelites now, or now going to be called Jews, could go home. It is right at that time, maybe months before, that the words that we hear in the gospel today are spoken by God through the prophet Isaiah. Not the historical prophet Isaiah, but one of his students, let's say. And this is the text, and I wanted just to share it with you because it's a powerful text. It starts off this way. Now imagine you're in exile, and maybe you're already the second generation in exile, so that remembrance of where you came from is already lost, that you don't even know what Palestine, what Israel and Judah looks like, that your livelihood is now completely dependent upon Babylon. Your whole purpose of being is to live there in Babylon. And now you get word that Cyrus has said, you all can go back home. And they don't know what home is. And they're fearful and anxious. And so in that fear and anxiety, they begin to question and wonder what's going to happen to them. What is this going to be? How do we even get there? You know, do we create a Google page on MapQuest and get us home? No, they don't have that at all, do they? And so they have no clue what's between Babylon and where they're going to end up in Palestine. And so the prophet, God speaks through the prophet Isaiah, as the children heard today. The prophet Isaiah is given these special words. And this is how it starts off. This is chapter 40 in the prophet Isaiah. Comfort, give comfort to my people. If you have to say that, right, it must mean that the people are not very comfortable with this whole thing, that they're fearful and anxious. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and tell her that her time of exile is at an end. Notice the words that God speaks. Speak tenderly, almost in the sense that God is saying, you've got to speak to the heart of these people because they're fearful and anxious, and they don't know what their future is. So you're going to have to use tender words, all right, that you're going to have to speak to their heart. And here's the text that it gets quoted in the gospel. A voice cries out, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill made low. The uneven ground. Well, let me give you an idea. Jim has some slides here, and I promise that I'm not going to bore you for my time here as interim with any homemade movies. Remember how that, at least when I was growing up, if somebody brought out the big projector with the Super 8 camera, that it meant that home movies were going to be shown. So I promise I won't bore you with a lot of home movies. Let's see if we can get it on the big screen.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's happening.
Something happening. There we go. I know it's not, you can't see it too well, but back in September, after many years of reflection, I decided I was going to walk part of the Camino de Santiago, which is in Spain. And if you've ever heard the Camino de Santiago, it's a very ancient pilgrimage that people would either go to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, or to Rome. This is during the Middle Ages, right? During the 12th century, 13th century, 14th century. They would set off. Maybe the priest in their hometown would say, you know, you really committed a bad sin. You need to go on a pilgrimage to Santiago. Well, people would set out in the middle of Germany, in the middle of France, and they would set out, and sometimes, well, let me tell you, it took them a year to walk the distance from home, never to be heard from again. Some of them died along the way. I saw a couple of places where people had died along the way. Well, at my age, I knew that I was not going to do more than a few days of walking on this. Some people have walked, the goal is to walk from the border of France and Spain all the way to Santiago, which is almost 600 kilometers, almost 500 miles. And people take about a month or more to do this. I didn't have a month. So I set out, this is just an attempt to give you an idea. It's a little place, if you can see it over there, it's on the right side where it says Samos and Sarria. That's where I started. And Sarria is this town on the Camino where people start to go, because you have to walk at least 100 kilometers to get what's called the Compostela, which is their certificate that you've accomplished this route, all right? So that was my goal. So I set off, flew into Madrid, took the train up to Sarria, and began my pilgrimage. I thought I was in pretty good shape, but let me tell you, the way, if you show the next picture, this is what I thought it was going to be, all right? And again, listening in the background to the words of Isaiah, you know, every rough place is going to be made, the hills are going to be made low, and the valleys are going to be lifted up. And that all sounds great, but let me tell you, this is what I thought. I think the next picture will show you that, you see, every town that you spend the night in is in the valley, which means every morning when you got up to start your walk for the day, you had to go up at least 800 feet up to climb to the top of the mountain so that you could walk along the crest of the mountain. And then the next town was in the valley, so that meant you had to go down 800 feet and then up 800 feet or more. And so you can see that the way from Sarria to Santiago is not a level way, it's hills and valleys and ups and downs. And let me tell you, I was not prepared for that at all. To climb 800 feet, walk along the ridge. And you see the next picture, I think, this is what the ancient pilgrims had to walk on. Now, I mean, if you can, you can't, I stood at the top of this. Now, this is on my second day. I had already walked the first day, 17 miles. The second day, this was halfway through another 17-mile day. And the third day was going to be 22 miles. And the fourth day was going to be another 17 miles. And the fifth day that I was going to make it into Santiago was 15 miles. So halfway through the second day of 17 miles, I get to the top of this walk and I go, are you kidding me? I was already starting to get blisters on my feet and my knee, and I'm walking like this already. And I get to the top of that and I go, seriously. But being the kind of person that I am, I said, if the ancient pilgrims could do it. Now imagine, I've got high-tech hiking shoes on, right? The ancient pilgrims, lucky, if they were lucky, had sandals at the most. No socks, probably. So they had to walk hundreds and hundreds of miles with barely nothing. The next slide is to show you, this was the path that I loved. So to go from the rocky path, where, I mean, every step down hurt, to finally get to a place where you could walk a level path was absolutely amazing and welcome indeed. The second day, I walked 3 hours in fog. Now that was just something coming from Arizona that we just don't see, right? It was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And the final slide is, this was how you knew where to go. That you followed, because otherwise, how would you know the path? And so the path was always marked by the first one there is the shell of Santiago. And then there would be yellow arrows along the way, painted on the wall, sometimes painted on the pavement, wherever, that you knew how to go. And I show you this because in September, I plan everything out. I make maps, I know exactly where I'm going, I know what to do, and this totally threw me off. because I was completely dependent, even though I had on my little phone with the GPS. But you all know, right? When you use GPS, does it always take you the right way? No. And so I was totally dependent on making the path by way of these arrows. At one point, there was a bypass, and I ended up on the bypass and had no clue where I was. And most of the time, I didn't know. Now, I just share that with you because imagine in the 6th century before the Common Era, hearing the words that tomorrow, by the way, we're all going to go back home. And you have no clue. And if you have any idea of the geography of the area, imagine going from the area of roughly, let's say, modern day Baghdad to Jerusalem, across the desert. It's just like, are you kidding me? That's why many Israelites, many Jews stayed in Babylon, because they went, there's no way we're crossing the desert. And I don't care what God says, that the mountains are going to be made low and the valleys are going to be filled in. We know better that that's not going to happen. And so they set off on this course. Okay, that's history. Remember that one of the things, and I mentioned last week that there are layers of entry points into the scripture. And one of the entry points is going to have to be, we have to get used to it. And I think modern Americans are just not used to this. We're not used to, we want things to be black and white. We want it to be plain and simple and straightforward. And the scripture often uses metaphors. That's your, by the way, sometimes you'll hear me say a metaphor. That's your $100 theological word for the day. It's not really a theological word, but it's a good word to remember. A metaphor, well, I should have looked it up in the dictionary to get the right definition for it. But it says one thing, but it's not to be taken literally, right? It's almost like in struggling with the children today, it's like somebody said, well, how are we getting to Bethlehem? And we're not there in Bethlehem. So maybe it's not literally traveling to Bethlehem, but metaphorically we get to Bethlehem, right? So the metaphor is wilderness. Yes, it is wilderness. You can imagine being there in the middle of the desert in Babylon. And Babylon at that time was a desert. And you're telling me in this desert, good things are going to happen? Or is it the wilderness, and some translations, right, it just depends upon where you put a comma in a sentence as to what it's going to mean. A voice in the wilderness, or in the wilderness, a voice. That doesn't sound different, does it? But there's a subtle difference. Is it that when we get out into the wilderness, you're going to hear this voice? Or is it in the wilderness where we find ourselves now that we hear the voice? We all have to admit that the last year and a half during the pandemic was like a wilderness, We're barely coming back, and many of us, that's why we have Facebook friends on this morning, right? That many of us are still concerned about getting into a crowd of people. So it's like a wilderness, meaning not literally. Here in Arizona, we know what wildernesses are, right? You don't have to go too far out of the city to get a wilderness, meaning where there's nothing but cactus and creepy animals, right? And snakes and scorpions and everything else, I guess. It's not empty totally. But the wilderness is not just a geographical location. It can be an emotional and spiritual location too. An empty place in our lives that is just that, empty. Where there's not much feeling. Maybe the emotion is anxiety, depression, despair. Sometimes it even leads to hopelessness. Are we ever, I'm sure most everybody has said it, right? Are we ever going to get back to normal? How many have ever said that before? Are we ever going to get back to normal? Personal opinion? No. because everything's different now. Everything's changed. It's just not going to be. That's a part of the fear and anxiety. Is it ever, why would I leave what I know to go to some place that I don't know? And you're telling me with words of comfort and tenderness that it's going to be okay? I don't know. And I said last week I'm from Missouri, and the motto of Missouri is, right? Show me. I need more evidence. I need more proof, God, before I'm going to set off from this wilderness, geographical, to that wilderness, metaphorical, that I need something more to go on. And that's the problem, that we need something to go on. When in fact, this journey, imagine, as you told the story to the children, imagine Mary and Joseph setting off to go to Bethlehem. You know, today, if you were to go there and get in a car to go from Galilee in the north, Nazareth, where Mary and Joseph lived, to Bethlehem, today, if you did it, it'd probably take you about 3 hours to drive. Because you're driving in a car on a modern highway. In Mary and Joseph's time, it took you 3 days to make the trip. And you didn't go by way of a road. You went, like me, up, down, up, down. Imagine riding on a donkey the whole way. And Mary and Joseph are told to go to Bethlehem. Wow. What does it take to move from one location to another, from one wilderness that really is a wilderness, to another place, here the wilderness meaning a place that is unknown, uncertain, unsure? What moves us there? You hear a chalice are in that place, aren't you? Where do we go? How are we going to get there? Why are we even doing it? And so here's the words. Notice it says that God says all of this is going to take place. Do we just take it at God's word? Or is there something more that we need? And what we need is some hope. Is some hope. Meaning, okay, it's not just trusting God, but it's having hope that what God says will come true. It's like many things, right? Having some hope. So I just want to read this a little bit. I don't do this very often, but I just wanted to make sure I got it right. This comes from one of my favorite writers, Walter Brueggemann. If you ever heard of him, he's just a fabulous, fabulous biblical scholar. I just love, I've got every book of his almost on my bookshelf. And he says this about hope. Hope in gospel faith is not just a vague feeling that things will work out. We have lots of those kinds of things, huh? Just a vague, oh, I hope that someday I get to do this. Oh, I hope that someday I get to do this. Oh, I hope that, I get a good grade on a test. Or, gee, I hope, so that it's not just a vague feeling. For it is evidence that things will not just work out. That we have hope, but sometimes it's just like, it's just not going to work out. We have hope that the pandemic will get over. I have hope that it will. But we know what? Until people get vaccinated, until people stop doing crazy things, it won't get over. Rather, Walter Brueggemann says, hope, now listen carefully, hope is the conviction, different from just feelings, is the conviction against a great deal of data that God is tenacious and persistent in overcoming the deathliness of the world, that God intends joy and peace. Christians find compelling evidence in the story of Jesus that Jesus, with great persistence and great vulnerability, everywhere he went, turned the enmity, the anxiety, the hate, the anger, the fear, the enmity of society towards a new possibility. Turned the sadness of the world towards joy, introduced a new regime where the dead are raised, the lost are found, and the displaced brought home again. Now think about that. That's what he did. If you want evidence, right? Look at the story of Jesus. If you want proof, the Israelites did get back to Palestine and reestablished themselves and rebuilt their lives and their faith community. They did that. There's lots of proof and evidence if we just allow ourselves to see it and have hope that even though I see nothing in the present, I have confidence and assuredness that it will happen sometime, maybe sometime near, maybe more. So what the words of John saying in reference to the prophet Isaiah, folks, we got to prepare ourselves and hold on to hope and persist in knowing what we know about our faith, that God will make this work out. But you know what? One more thing. We have to partner with God. It can't be just God doing it. We got to do it. And look what it says. He introduced a new regime where the dead are raised, the lost are found, the displaced are home again, brought home again. There it is. What more evidence will we have when we do these things to transform the world? Filled with hope, filled with confidence and trust in God's power to do this, in God's power in us to accomplish